They had a name for it, not heaven, not hell, not purgatory, or the void, or any of the softened words we use today to make the ending feel less final. The Sumerians called it Kur, and the moment you understand what they believed waited on the other side of death, you start to wonder whether they weren't describing something they'd been told. The civilization that gave us writing, mathematics, astronomy, legal codes, and the concept of kingship also left behind something nobody talks about in school. Buried in cuneiform tablets that sat untouched for 4,000 years, they recorded detailed, specific accounts of what happens when a human being dies. Not allegory, not poetry. Not the wishful thinking of a culture afraid of the dark, structured, consistent, cross-referenced descriptions of a process with named entities, named locations, named procedures, and a destination that sounds less like mythology and more like a system designed by someone who understood exactly what a human soul is and what to do with it once the body stops functioning. 5 of those descriptions survived. 5 accounts that don't fully agree with each other, which is exactly the kind of detail that should stop you in your tracks. Because religions invented to comfort people tend to be consistent. They smooth over the contradictions. They give you one clean story. But what these tablets describe is something messier, something that reads more like witnesses reporting from different angles on the same event, each one catching details the others missed. The first 4 are disturbing enough. The 5th is the one that mainstream historians have the hardest time explaining, the one that researchers in the ancient astronaut field have been circling for decades, the one that requires you to consider a possibility so uncomfortable that most people instinctively reject it before they've even heard it fully. This is what the Sumerians said happens after you die. The first description is the one scholars call the descent of Inanna, and it begins with the most important detail that everyone overlooks. Before we get to what the underworld looks like, before we get to its geography and its rulers and its laws, the tablet tells us something structural. It tells us that the underworld has gates. 7 of them, to be exact. And at each gate, something is taken from you. Inanna, the goddess of love and war and the evening star, decides to descend into the great below. The text doesn't spend a lot of time explaining why. Different scholars have proposed different theories over the years. She's going to attend the funeral rites of her sister's husband. She's going to expand her domain. She's going to challenge the Queen of the Dead for control of the underworld itself. What matters for our purposes isn't the motivation. What matters is what happens on the way down. She approaches the first gate. The gatekeeper, a being named Neti, meets her and demands she identify herself. She does. He disappears to inform his queen, a figure named Ereshkigal, that someone is at the outer door. Ereshkigal, whose name translates roughly as Great Lady of the Great Earth, doesn't appear to be surprised. She issues specific instructions. Let her in, but make her remove something at every gate. So Inanna enters the first gate, and the great crown on her head is removed. She asks why. Neti tells her to be quiet. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. She enters the second gate, and the rod of lapis lazuli in her hand is taken. The third gate, the necklace around her neck. The fourth gate, the ornaments from her chest. The fifth gate, the gold ring on her hand. The sixth gate, the breastplate that covers her body. The seventh gate, the royal robe from her shoulders. 7 gates, 7 removals. By the time she reaches the throne room of Ereshkigal, she is naked and bowed low. Now, there are scholars who read this as pure allegory, the stripping away of divine attributes, a goddess humbled, a metaphor for the universality of death, that even the most powerful being cannot keep her treasures in the grave. That reading is valid, as far as it goes, but it doesn't fully account for the specificity of what's being removed. The great crown, the rod of lapis lazuli, the necklace, the chest ornaments, the gold ring, the breastplate, the royal robe, 7 items, in a specific order, at 7 specific gates. Because here's the question that rarely gets asked. Why 7? The number 7 is not random in Sumerian cosmology. It shows up with striking consistency across every major Sumerian text. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second. Because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete decoding of all 12 codes, the tablet numbers, the translated passages, the astronomical date they specified down to the degree, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. 7 divine laws, called the Me, which we'll return to in the 5th description. 7 tablets of destiny. 7 sages sent before the flood. 7 gates to the underworld. The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. They didn't repeat a number accidentally. There's a hypothesis that has been circulating in alternative research circles for decades, and it centers on the idea that the 7 gates of the Sumerian underworld might be a description of something the Anunnaki designed, not a natural feature of the afterlife, not a spiritual metaphor invented by priests, but a constructed passage, a deliberate system with checkpoints, each one calibrated to strip away something specific from a being moving through it. When you frame it that way, the question of what's being stripped away becomes much more interesting. Because Inanna isn't just losing jewelry. In Sumerian theology, each of those items she's wearing corresponds to a specific aspect of her divine power, her ability to command armies, her authority over fertility, her connection to celestial events, her dominion over the physical world. She's not being undressed. She's being depowered, systematically, gate by gate, layer by layer, until nothing remains but the essential being underneath. And if the Anunnaki were managing this process, if this was a checkpoint system they built rather than a natural feature of the cosmos, then the question becomes even more unsettling. Why would an advanced intelligence design a passage that strips away power and capability from the beings moving through it? What's waiting on the other side that requires a soul to arrive powerless? Ereshkigal looked at Inanna when she entered the throne room, and Inanna died. The text says this simply, without dramatic elaboration. Ereshkigal fastened her eye upon Inanna, the eye of death. She spoke the word of wrath against her. She uttered a cry against her, the cry of guilt. She struck her, and Inanna was turned into a corpse, a piece of rotting meat, and hung from a hook on the wall. This is where the allegory explanation runs into problems. Because if this is pure mythology, if Inanna's descent is simply a metaphor for winter, and her return is simply a metaphor for spring, then we don't need the hook on the wall. We don't need the rotting meat. We don't need the 3-day death before the rescue. These details are too specific, too unpleasant, too precisely clinical to be the product of a culture that just needed a seasonal story. What the tablet describes, in functional terms, is a being passing through a checkpoint system, being stripped of her defensive capabilities, arriving at a final chamber, and being killed by a specific directed force. The Eye of Ereshkigal is not described as a weapon in the conventional sense. It's described as something that has an effect. Looking at someone has a physical consequence. That detail alone has attracted intense scrutiny from researchers who point to it as evidence that what's being described is technology, not theology. Inanna stays dead on the wall for 3 days and 3 nights. Her assistant, a being named Ninshuber, who was instructed to seek help if Inanna didn't return within 3 days, goes to Enlil, the king of the gods, for help. Enlil refuses. She goes to Nanna, the moon god. Nanna refuses. She goes to Enki, the god of wisdom and water, and here the tablet shifts in a way that's subtle but significant. Enki doesn't refuse. Enki also doesn't seem surprised. He creates 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, a Kurgara and a Galater, small creatures with no particular divine status, and he gives them the food of life and the water of life. He instructs them to sneak into the underworld and find Ereshkigal and give her these substances. There's a trick in how he sets this up. He tells the Kurgara and Galater to agree with everything Ereshkigal says. When she moans in pain, agree. When she cries out in suffering, agree. Validate her suffering. And in gratitude, she'll offer them a gift. They are to ask for the corpse on the hook. They are to sprinkle the food and water of life on it 60 times. This works. Inanna is revived. She passes back through the 7 gates, and at each gate, her items are returned to her in reverse order. The full circle of that reversal is important. What was taken can be given back, in a specific order, through a specific process. This is not how myths typically work. Myths rarely specify that the reversal must happen in reverse order, at the same specific gates, through the same specific mechanism. This reads more like a protocol, a restoration procedure. And the fact that Enki knew the procedure and executed it successfully suggests he had dealt with something like this before, or that he had designed the system in the first place. The deeper researchers go into the descent of Inanna, the more they notice that it functions less as a story and more as a technical document with a narrative wrapper. The number of gates is not arbitrary. The sequence of removals is not arbitrary. The 3 days of death are not arbitrary. The specific rescue procedure involving 2 non-divine beings and the food and water of life is not arbitrary. But here's what the tablet does not explain. It doesn't tell us where the souls of ordinary humans go when they pass through those 7 gates. Inanna is a goddess. She has divine attributes to remove. She has powerful allies who know the restoration procedure. What happens to a human being with no divine attributes, no powerful allies, and no access to the food of life and the water of life? For that, we need the second description. There's a text that has been given various names by scholars, but it's most commonly known by a phrase from inside the text itself, the land of no return. And what it describes for ordinary human souls is about as far from the paradise of later religious traditions as it's possible to get while still being a vision of the afterlife. This is not a reward. This is not a punishment. What the second Sumerian description of death gives us is something far stranger than either. It gives us a warehouse. The Sumerian underworld, as described across multiple tablets, including the myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and the fragments of what scholars call the Sumerian death of Gilgamesh, is a place of enormous scale. Its dimensions are never precisely stated, but the language used to describe it implies vast horizontal expanse rather than vertical depth. It is wide and dark. Its roads are roads from which no traveler returns. Its inhabitants are not suffering in fire or floating in bliss. They are existing. The word the Sumerians used for the dead is the same word they used for image or shade. The Akkadian translation uses the word etemu, meaning spirit or ghost. But neither translation captures what the tablets actually describe, because what the tablets describe is something with a specific quality of existence that has no good modern equivalent. The dead in the Sumerian underworld are present but depleted. They are there, but not fully there. They remember who they were. They can communicate within limits, but they do not eat in the way the living eat. They do not drink in the way the living drink. They subsist on what is left to them by the living, offerings poured into the earth, and in the absence of those offerings, they eat dust and clay. This detail about eating dust and clay is one of the most repeated images in all of Sumerian afterlife literature, and it almost always gets read as poetic. Misery expressed through metaphor. But read it alongside the other descriptions of what the underworld is, and a different interpretation becomes possible. The dead are not eating dust and clay to express sadness. The dead are eating dust and clay because that is, literally, the only substance available to them in the environment where they exist. The underworld, in this description, has no food. It has no light, or only the lowest light, described in some tablets as the light that exists at the beginning of dawn before the sun has fully risen. It has no water in the normal sense. It is not designed to sustain biological life, because the beings in it are no longer biologically alive. What it is designed to do is contain them. Every soul that enters the underworld is assigned a space. The word sometimes translated as seat or place in the tablets implies a designated location, not random wandering. The dead know where their place is. There's a gatekeeping system, not 7 gates in this description, but a different threshold structure, presided over by the same basic hierarchy, with Ereshkigal at the top, her husband Nergal, the god of plague and war, beside her, and a court of 7 judges called the Anunnaki seated before the throne. Wait, the Anunnaki seated in the underworld, serving as judges of the dead. Not on earth, not in the heavens. In the underworld, which is described simultaneously as the physical interior of the earth and as a separate dimensional space, depending on which tablet you're reading, the Anunnaki are positioned in the second description, not as distant sky gods, but as active administrators of the dead, the entities who evaluate incoming souls and determine their status and their placement. This is a detail that the ancient astronaut framework has built an entire theory around, and it's worth understanding why. If the Anunnaki were purely mythological, if they were invented gods created to explain natural phenomena, then their presence in the underworld, serving as judges of the dead, would be a natural religious development, similar to how many cultures developed divine judgment mythology. The soul stands before God and is evaluated. Standard spiritual narrative. But the Anunnaki, across the whole of Sumerian literature, are not described the way invented gods typically get described. They have specific roles, they have hierarchies, they have meetings. They have disagreements that get resolved through negotiation rather than divine fiat. They build things. They give instructions to humans using specific, functional language rather than the vague spiritual pronouncements of most deity traditions. They have a home planet, they arrived. And in multiple texts, they express concern about things that omnipotent beings typically do not need to worry about. Things like the labor burden of lesser divine beings, the management of human population, and what happens to human souls after death. So, when the Sumerian texts place the Anunnaki in the underworld as judges, the ancient astronaut interpretation asks a simple question. What if they were actually there? Not as spiritual metaphors, as actual administrators. What if the underworld is not a mythological location but a functional one, and the beings running it were not invented by priests but were described by people who had been told or shown exactly how the system worked. Gilgamesh, after the death of his companion Enkidu, is devastated. He travels, in the myth of Gilgamesh, through the mountains at the edge of the world to find Utnapishtim, the only human ever granted immortality, because he wants to understand how to escape the fate that awaits all human beings. He's not just grieving, he's searching for a way out of the system. And in the process of this search, he learns things. His companion Enkidu, before he fully dies, has a dream of the underworld. He describes being taken by a being with the face of a bird of prey and the hands and claws of an eagle. This being takes him down to the house of darkness, to the house where those who enter never come out again. He describes meeting people he recognizes, people who were kings and priests and scribes on earth, now serving minor functions in the underworld. A king who used to be served by dozens of attendants now serves meat. A high priest performs minor functions. The powerful have lost their power, but they have not lost their identity. They know who they were. This is the detail that cuts through the allegory explanation. If the underworld is just a poetic metaphor for death, for the absence of life, then there's no need to specify that the dead retain their identities, remember their earthly roles, and exist in a hierarchy that mirrors but diminishes the hierarchy of life. If you're writing an allegory, you don't need the former king to be specifically serving meat to the court. You just say the mighty are brought low. The specific functional detail of what they're doing suggests that someone who saw this, or was told about it in detail, was reporting rather than inventing. The second description, taken as a whole, is a picture of a massive holding facility, a place designed to receive the dead, process them through a judgment procedure run by specific named administrators, assign them designated spaces, and maintain them indefinitely in a low-energy state. They are not destroyed, they are not reborn. They are stored. They remember who they are. They can be communicated with by the living under certain conditions. And they remain there, in the land of no return, until something changes the terms of the arrangement. What could change the terms? The second description doesn't say. But the third one suggests a partial answer, and it comes from a completely unexpected direction. The third Sumerian description of what happens after death comes from a text known as the Death of Ur-Nama, and it shifts the perspective in a way that's easy to miss if you're not paying close attention. The first two descriptions told us about the underworld in structural terms: the gates, the taking, the warehouse of shades, the Anunnaki judges. The third description does something different. It tells us what happens during the transition itself, from the perspective of someone going through it. And what it describes, filtered through the ancient astronaut lens, starts to read less like a soul journey and more like an intake procedure. Ur-Nama was a historical figure, not a mythological one. He was a real king of Ur who died around 2095 BCE. He built the Great Ziggurat of Ur, which still partially stands today. He codified the first law code in human history, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries. He was, by the standards of his time, enormously significant. And when he died, a lamentation text was written describing what happened to him, not just the grief of the people, but what happened to Ur-Nama himself in the transition. The text begins with his death on the battlefield, under circumstances that are described as unexpected and wrong. The gods themselves seem to have made an error, and Enlil in particular is blamed for abandoning his faithful king at the moment of death. This detail is interesting because it implies that the manner and timing of a person's death is not random, not the product of fate in an impersonal sense, but the result of choices made by specific entities with specific authority over whether a person lives or dies. Ur-Nama is taken down to the underworld, but the journey there is described as a process with multiple stages and multiple encounters. He arrives in the great below and is received. The key detail here is the word received, not deposited, not discarded. The death text uses language that implies an organized welcome, a reception, which again fits the picture of a managed facility rather than a natural phenomenon. He is given gifts. He distributes these gifts to the key figures of the underworld, to Nergal, to Gilgamesh, who is specifically described as a judge of the dead in this text, to other beings of the lower realm. This gifting procedure has a transactional quality to it. Ur-Nama is not just arriving. He is conducting a ritual that establishes his status in the new environment. The gifts create relationships, or activate existing protocols, that determine where in the hierarchy of the underworld he will exist. This is where the ancient astronaut interpretation begins to diverge sharply from the standard scholarly reading. Because the mainstream explanation for the gifting is that it's a literary device reflecting the belief that a king's status in life should be maintained in death, that the great Ur-Nama wouldn't simply disappear into the anonymous crowd of dead souls, but would retain his importance. That reading makes sense on a surface level, but there's another way to read it. If the underworld is a managed system, with administrators and a hierarchy, then a new arrival who wants favorable placement in that system needs to signal his value. The gifts are not expressions of royal dignity. They are the currency of the underworld economy. They are what Ur-Nama is exchanging for a better position within the facility. And the fact that this exchange happens through specific named beings in specific named roles suggests that whoever described this process understood exactly how placement decisions in the underworld worked. There's a moment in the text that rarely gets discussed in standard commentary, but that jumps out immediately if you're reading it through the lens of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. Ur-Nama, after his initial reception, is described as performing certain functions in the underworld. He manages things. He oversees. The text gives him a role. He's not just a shade on a hook. He's not eating dust and clay in an anonymous corner. He has been assigned a position with actual responsibilities. Why would a system that merely stores the dead need the dead to have responsibilities? If the underworld is just a holding area, a vast passive repository, then the dead don't need to do anything. They just exist. But the death of Ur-Nama describes a system in which certain privileged dead are given roles. They manage. They coordinate. They perform functions within the ongoing operation of the facility. This implies that the facility has an ongoing operation, something that needs to be managed. Something that benefits from having organized, experienced souls in administrative positions. And if that's true, then the underworld described in the Sumerian texts is not passive, it is active. It is a place where things happen, where processes run, where an organizational hierarchy with both divine and formerly human members operates continuously. From the ancient astronaut standpoint, this is one of the most significant structural details in all of Sumerian afterlife literature, because it implies that the Anunnaki, in managing the underworld, were using the souls of qualified dead humans as part of the management infrastructure, not mistreating them, not torturing them, employing them, assigning them functions that match their skills and experience from life. A king who managed a city is given management functions in the underworld. A priest who performed rituals is given ritual functions. The system is not random, it is efficient. The question this raises, for anyone willing to sit with it, is the same question that comes up repeatedly in ancient astronaut theory whenever the Anunnaki seem to be managing things for a purpose. What is the purpose? What are they managing the underworld for? What function does it serve that requires this level of organization, this level of active administration, this level of involvement by beings who, elsewhere in Sumerian literature, are described as the creators of humanity itself? We'll return to that question in the fifth description. But the third gives us one more detail before it ends. And this detail is the most disturbing thing in the death of Ur-Nama, not because it's violent or threatening, but because of what it implies about the structure of the universe the Sumerians believed they lived in. Ur-Nama, from the underworld, sends a message back to his people. The text describes him communicating to the living, sending word through some mechanism that the tablets don't fully explain, about the state of things in the great below and about what the living should know. This communication is treated in the text as exceptional, as something that happened because Ur-Nama was a great king and the circumstances of his death were irregular, not as routine. But it's treated as possible. The barrier between the living and the dead is not described as absolute. It is described as a barrier with specific conditions under which it can be crossed, in both directions. This permeability of the boundary between life and death is a recurring feature of Sumerian afterlife literature that mainstream scholarship tends to smooth over. Communication between the dead and the living is treated as possible in multiple texts, under controlled conditions, usually involving specific rituals or specific entities acting as intermediaries. The dead are not gone, they are elsewhere. And elsewhere, in the Sumerian model, is not infinitely far away. Before moving to the fourth description, it's worth stepping back and noticing something about the three descriptions we've covered so far. They are consistent in structure even when they disagree in details. They all describe the underworld as a physical location with physical properties. They all describe a managed transition with administrative stages. They all describe the dead as retaining identity and existing in a hierarchy. They all describe the Anunnaki or Anunnaki-adjacent beings as active administrators. What they don't describe, even in the most optimistic reading, is rest, peace, paradise, joy. The land of no return is not comfortable. It is not designed to reward. The most favorable existence available to the dead in these three descriptions is a functional role in a large, dimly lit administrative facility where you eat dust in your off hours and wait for living relatives to make offerings. That is the best-case scenario. The fourth description introduces something that doesn't fit that pattern, and it comes from a source that scholars have argued about for more than a century, because the text it comes from appears to describe a way out. There is a fragment, discovered at Nippur, that is part of a larger text sometimes called the Sumerian paradise myth. It describes a place called Dilmun, and it is unlike anything else in Sumerian literature. In all the other descriptions, the afterlife is universal and grim. Everyone goes to Kur, everyone eats dust. Even the great kings get a dimly lit administrative job if they're lucky. But Dilmun is different. Dilmun is described as a place where the sun rises, where animals don't harm each other, where sickness is absent, where old age is absent, where death is absent. Dilmun is not the underworld. It is explicitly distinguished from the underworld. It exists somewhere else, under different conditions, operating by different rules. And crucially, certain beings and certain humans are there. Not all humans, not all beings, specific ones. Utnapishtim, the man Gilgamesh goes searching for in the epic that bears his name, the only human granted immortality, lives in Dilmun. He lives there because he was placed there, after surviving the flood, by the decision of the Anunnaki Council. This raises a question that the standard mythological reading completely fails to account for. If the afterlife is fixed, if everyone goes to Kur, if the land of no return is universal by definition, then how is Utnapishtim in Dilmun? How is a human being living indefinitely without dying, in a place that's neither the underworld nor the earth? And more specifically, who has the authority to make that happen? Who decided that Utnapishtim gets the exception? The Anunnaki Council did, collectively. Through a deliberative process described in the flood narrative, they sat and discussed and voted on whether Utnapishtim should be allowed to survive and what should be done with him afterward. And the result of that deliberation was that he was placed in Dilmun, at the mouth of the rivers, in a location that sounds geographically specific but that cannot be identified with any place on the current map of the world. The ancient astronaut interpretation of Dilmun is one of the more sophisticated arguments in the field. The basic claim centers on this. Dilmun is not a mythological paradise invented to comfort the living. Dilmun is a real place, possibly off-planet, possibly in a different dimension, definitely outside the normal operating conditions of Earth, where the Anunnaki kept specific favored humans in an indefinitely extended lifespan. Not immortality in the metaphysical sense, but biological extension, the absence of aging and sickness and death, because the environment didn't permit those processes to run. The evidence cited for this reading includes the fact that Dilmun is described with physical specificity, including geography and climate, not with the vague, idealized language that purely mythological paradises tend to use. It includes the fact that access to Dilmun is not granted through spiritual merit or virtue in the conventional religious sense, but through specific decisions by specific named entities with specific authority. Enki arranged for Utnapishtim's survival. The Anunnaki Council voted on it. These are not the mechanisms by which religious traditions grant access to paradise. These are the mechanisms by which a management hierarchy makes an exception to standard operating procedure. It also includes a detail that the text makes quietly but clearly. Dilmun has fresh water. The waters of Enki flow there. Before the text mentions its paradisiacal qualities, it mentions its water, and the arrival of that water as a specific event that was arranged rather than naturally occurring. Someone brought the water to Dilmun. Someone set up the conditions that make it a place where life can be sustained in the extended form it takes there. The paradise wasn't natural, it was built. And if the paradise was built, then the contrast with the underworld becomes even more stark. The underworld is also built. The underworld also has conditions that were set up, a managed environment with a specific quality of existence enforced upon its inhabitants. The difference between the underworld and Dilmun is not the difference between hell and heaven in the theological sense. It's the difference between two different facilities with two different purposes and two different sets of conditions. One is designed for long-term storage with minimal maintenance. The other is designed for extended living with full biological function. Who gets which one? That question brings us to the fifth description, the one nobody wants to believe. The one that, if you take it seriously, changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The running total at this point is approximately 31,500 characters, meaning we need about 114,000 more to reach 145,500. Sections 3 through 5 need to be substantially longer. Let me continue writing sections of appropriate depth. Before we get to the fifth description, we need to understand something about how the Anunnaki appear in these texts. Not as vague divine figures, as specific individuals with specific personalities, specific areas of expertise, and specific agendas that sometimes conflict with each other. Because the fifth description is not a neutral document, it is a contested one. And the contestation is internal to the Sumerian texts themselves, between two Anunnaki figures, whose different approaches to humanity play out across dozens of tablets in ways that the ancient astronaut community has analyzed in exhaustive detail: Enlil and Enki. If you've spent any time in the ancient astronaut literature, you've encountered these two figures. Enlil, whose name translates roughly as Lord of the Wind or Lord of the Air, is the authority figure, the administrator, the one who issues decrees and commands obedience and appears throughout Sumerian literature as the primary human-facing authority of the Anunnaki. Enki, whose name translates roughly as Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Deep, is the engineer, the biologist, the one who creates things and solves problems and appears throughout Sumerian literature as the Anunnaki who has the most direct and complex relationship with human beings. Their personalities, as described across centuries of Sumerian writing, are strikingly consistent. Enlil is formal, hierarchical, rules-focused, and frequently disapproving of the human species he helped to oversee. He's the one who sends the flood. He's the one who refuses to help when Ninshubur comes to him asking for Inanna's rescue. He's the one who issues restrictive decrees about what humans may and may not do. He is not cruel in a sadistic sense, but he is cold. He manages humans the way a project manager manages a difficult contract, with an eye on the outcome and little sentimentality about the units doing the work. Enki is different. Enki warns Utnapishtim about the flood despite Enlil's decree of secrecy. Enki creates the Kurgara and Galater to rescue Inanna despite Enlil and Nanna refusing to act. Enki is the one, across multiple texts, who acts on behalf of human interests against the formal position of the Anunnaki hierarchy. And in the ancient astronaut interpretation, he's the one who may have given humans something they weren't supposed to have. Not fire, in the Promethean metaphor, but something more fundamental. Something that made the fifth description of the afterlife possible, and that made certain Anunnaki very uncomfortable when they figured out what he'd done. The fourth description set up the geography. The underworld for most, Dilmun for a few, the question of who gets which one. Now here is the structure that the fifth description builds on, and it comes from understanding what the Mi actually are. The Mi are one of the most discussed and least understood concepts in all of Sumerian scholarship. The word itself is difficult to translate. Some scholars render it as divine laws, others say divine powers. Others say something closer to the fundamental principles of civilization. The tablets that list the Mi describe over 100 of them, and the list is extraordinary in its specificity. It includes things you might expect from a divine law code. Truth, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the scribal art, music, the craft of the smith. But it also includes things that don't belong in a list of spiritual principles. The descent and ascent from the underworld treated as a technical process, the heroic weapon, the various priestly functions treated as practical skills, the art of lovemaking, the cult prostitute, the troubled heart, the rejoicing heart. The list is a mix of what we would call spiritual, technical, social, and biological categories treated with equal weight, as if they are all the same kind of thing. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, Inanna goes to Enki's home in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater dwelling that Enki inhabits, and during a drinking session, Enki gives her the Mi, all of them. Over 100 fundamental operating principles of civilization and existence transferred in a moment of intoxicated generosity. When he sobers up and asks where they went, he's told they've been taken to Uruk, to Inanna's city. He sends creatures to retrieve them. They fail. The Mi stay with Inanna, which means they stay accessible to humanity through her. This story has the surface structure of a myth about how civilization came to Sumer, how the gifts of the gods descended to humanity. But the ancient astronaut reading goes deeper. The Mi are not metaphors for civilization. The Mi are actual operational protocols. They are the software, to use an anachronistic but accurate metaphor, of existence. They govern not just civilization, but the fundamental processes of life, death, and everything between. And when Enki gave them to Inanna, and Inanna made them available to humanity through her city of Uruk, he may have given humans access to something they were not supposed to have. Direct operational understanding of the process by which souls are managed. This is the context in which the fifth description of the afterlife needs to be read, because the fifth description is not found in a single text. It is assembled from multiple sources, from fragments of the Gilgamesh epic, from portions of the descent of Inanna, from the ritual texts, from the hymns to Inanna and Enki, and it describes something that contradicts the finality of the underworld described in descriptions 1 through 3. It describes a mechanism by which the direction of the afterlife journey can be altered, not for everyone, not automatically, but under specific conditions, using specific knowledge, applied through specific procedures. This is what modern researchers in the ancient astronaut field refer to as the Sumerian afterlife protocol, and it is the most controversial element of this entire body of literature. The first element of the protocol is the knowledge that the soul, in Sumerian metaphysics, is not simple. It is composite. A human being is not a single spiritual entity, but a collection of components, each with a different status and different behavior after death. The Sumerians had specific words for these components. The atemu, which is the shade or ghost that ends up in the underworld. The Z, which is something closer to what we would call the life force or vital spirit. And there are additional components mentioned in various texts that don't map cleanly onto any of these categories, components that appear to have different destinations than the atemu. This multi-component model of the soul is one of the details that most intrigues researchers in the ancient astronaut field. Because if the soul has multiple components, and if different components behave differently after death, then the question of what happens after death does not have a single answer. Different parts of you go different places, and the question of which parts go where, and under what conditions, becomes much more interesting. The atemu goes to the underworld. That seems consistent across all the sources. The vital spirit, the Z, is more ambiguous. Some texts describe it dissipating. Others seem to imply it goes somewhere. And the additional components, the ones mentioned only in fragmentary contexts, are connected in the ancient astronaut interpretation to something very specific. Enki, in the creation narrative called the Atrahasis, creates human beings through a biological process that involves the mixing of divine blood, or divine essence, with clay, which is described as the body of the earth. The specific word used for the divine component varies across texts, but the implications are consistent. Human beings, in the Sumerian creation story, contain a component that came from the Anunnaki, not metaphorically, literally. A biological or spiritual substance originating from the divine beings was incorporated into the human prototype. This is why humans became capable of things that simple animals are not capable of. Language, complex thought, abstract reasoning. The ability to perform the me, to enact the fundamental operating principles of civilization. These capacities come from the incorporated divine substance. If that's true, then when a human being dies, the standard processing system, the 7 gates, the stripping, the warehouse of the underworld, has to deal with a being that contains something it wasn't originally designed to handle. The system was set up to process a certain kind of soul, the shade, the atemu, the depleted image of a person, but if there's a component of divine origin embedded in that soul, what does the system do with it? Does it strip it away at one of the 7 gates, along with everything else? Does it go somewhere separately? Does it remain embedded in the atemu throughout its existence in the underworld? This is the question that the 5th description addresses, and it's the one that nobody in the ancient astronaut community agrees on completely, because the source texts are fragmentary, and the interpretations diverge sharply at exactly the point where the answer would be most significant. Here is what can be assembled from the available evidence. The Sumerian texts, across multiple sources, contain references to a distinction between what happens to ordinary souls and what happens to souls that have been prepared. Prepared how? Through knowledge and through action during life. The rituals of the Igigi, the lesser divine beings who served the Anunnaki. The hymns to Inanna and Enki that were not merely songs but operational texts, encoding in their verse the specific sequences of the me. The temple practices that put a human being in contact with the divine substance in ways that were supposed to strengthen or activate the divine component within them. In the ancient astronaut reading, these rituals and hymns were not religious inventions. They were instructions. Technical instructions for how a human being, who wanted a different afterlife outcome, could prepare themselves during life to achieve that outcome. The preparation involved activating the divine component, making it more coherent and more distinct from the ordinary soul components, so that at death, when the system began to process you, the divine component would be recognized and handled differently. Differently how? This is where the ancient astronaut interpretations diverge. Some researchers argue that the divine component, once sufficiently activated, would not descend to the underworld at all, that it would be directed towards something like Dilmun. Others argue that it would still descend but would be processed differently, ascending back through the gates rather than being permanently installed in the warehouse. Still others argue that the divine component represents a piece of Anunnaki consciousness that was temporarily embodied in human form, and that at death it is simply retrieved, reabsorbed into the Anunnaki collective in a way that the ordinary human soul, the Atemu, cannot be. All three interpretations agree on one thing. The fifth description implies that the afterlife is not uniform. It implies that there is a default outcome, the underworld, the land of no return, and an exceptional outcome available to those who know how to pursue it. And the mechanism for pursuing it involves knowledge that the Anunnaki either gave to or withheld from humanity, depending on which Anunnaki you were dealing with. Enlil, in the ancient astronaut framework, represents the faction that preferred humans not to know about this. The underworld is designed, the seven gates and the warehouse and the dust and clay is the outcome Enlil's faction wanted for humanity. Keep the humans producing the labor they were created for, and when they die, store them in the managed facility below, and that's the end of it. The divine component they contain is either of no concern or is quietly retrieved by the system without the human involved being aware of it. Enki represents the faction that told them the flood warning, the rescue of Inanna, the giving of the me, the creation of humans with a more complete divine substance than Enlil approved of. All of these can be read as Enki repeatedly giving humanity more than the standard operating procedure allowed. And the fifth description of the afterlife, the one that implies a non-standard outcome is possible for those who know what they're doing, is the description that comes from Enki's tradition. This is why it's the one nobody wants to believe. Because if it's accurate, it means the afterlife is not a natural phenomenon. It means it is a managed system with a default outcome and exception conditions. It means that specific knowledge, the kind of knowledge encoded in the me, in the rituals, in the hymns, in the temple practices, is not spiritual in the vague modern sense, but operational. It means that the Sumerians who learned this knowledge from Enki or his traditions were not developing religion. They were learning how to navigate a system that had been built by someone else for purposes that may not have had humanity's interests as a primary concern. And it means that the question of what happens after you die has, or had, or under some reading of the texts still has, a technical answer, not a comforting one, not a simple one, but a specific, detailed, procedural answer that a civilization 4,000 years ago wrote down on clay tablets and buried in the ground, where it waited for us to dig it up and decide what to do with it. To understand the full weight of what the fifth description claims, you have to understand what the tablets were actually written on and why that matters more than most people realize. Modern scholarship treats cuneiform tablets as historical artifacts, windows into an ancient culture, and they are. But the ancient astronaut interpretation treats them as something else, as technical documents, as the written equivalent of instruction manuals, produced by a civilization that was recording what it had been shown rather than inventing what it imagined. The cuneiform writing system itself is relevant here. Cuneiform was not invented as a literary medium. It was invented as an accounting tool. The oldest cuneiform tablets, the ones that predate any narrative or mythological content by several centuries, are receipts and records. Quantities of grain, allocations of labor, numbers of animals. The civilization that eventually produced the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Descent of Inanna began by writing down numbers in columns because they needed an accurate record-keeping system for an economy of substantial complexity. And when they eventually began writing narrative, they brought the same precision mindset to it. The same culture that counted grain with obsessive exactitude described the seven gates of the underworld with the same specificity. The same culture that recorded labor quotas described the seven divine attributes removed at each gate and the specific procedure for reversing that removal. This is why the ancient astronaut interpretation insists that the Sumerian afterlife texts are not mythology in the usual sense. Mythology is impressionistic. It gestures toward meaning. The Sumerian texts specify. They name names, give gate counts, describe procedures, list the order of events. They do this because the culture that produced them was built on the habit of specificity. And if that culture described the afterlife with the same specificity it used for grain accounting, then the question of whether we should take the specificity seriously is not a trivial one. Let's return to Gilgamesh, because his journey in search of immortality is the fullest version of what the ancient astronaut field calls the afterlife investigation narrative. A human being, partially divine by descent, who loses someone dear to him, becomes so disturbed by the reality of death that he undertakes an epic journey to find out if there's a way around it. And what he discovers, the answer Utnapishtim gives him at the end of that journey, is the most honest statement in all of Sumerian literature about the human condition. Utnapishtim tells him that there is a plant at the bottom of the waters that can restore youth, not immortality, youth. Gilgamesh dives and gets it. On the way home, he stops to rest and bathe, and a serpent smells the plant, comes up from the water, and takes it. The serpent rejuvenates and slithers away, leaving its shed skin on the bank. Gilgamesh weeps, and then he goes home. This ending is almost universally read as tragic. The hero's quest fails. He doesn't get immortality. He doesn't even get the youth plant. He gets to watch a snake take it and then has to walk home. The lesson is humility. Accept your mortality. Live within human limits. But the ancient astronaut reading sees something else in that ending. It sees a clue that's been hiding in plain sight for 4,000 years. The serpent is not a random animal in Sumerian symbolism. The serpent is one of the primary symbols associated with Enki. In the story of Enki and Ninhursag, the Paradise of Dilmun story, the narrative turns on serpents and plants in ways that scholars have compared to the Genesis story for centuries. Enki is frequently depicted with serpents in the iconography of the period. The Sumerian symbol for medicine, for life, for the wisdom of the deep, is the entwined serpent, which we still use today in the medical caduceus. The connection between the serpent and Enki is not incidental. It is one of the most consistent visual and textual associations in all of Sumerian iconography. So when a serpent takes the plant of youth from Gilgamesh, the question from the ancient astronaut perspective is not, what does this symbolize, but who sent it? If the serpent represents Enki, or an agent of Enki, then the taking of the plant is not random animal behavior. It is a deliberate act. The plant was retrieved by someone who knew where it was, who knew Gilgamesh would find it, and who wanted it back. Why? That question loops back to the fundamental tension in Sumerian literature between the different Anunnaki factions and what they wanted for humanity. If the plant of youth, like the me, like the divine essence in the human soul, represents something that should or should not be accessible to humans based on which faction's position you take, then the serpent's retrieval of the plant is not a cruel random event. It is the system working as one faction intended it to work. What Gilgamesh briefly possesses is something the Anunnaki had decided humans should not keep. And the method of retrieval, an animal appearing at a moment of human vulnerability, is precisely the kind of indirect intervention that appears repeatedly in Sumerian texts about how the Anunnaki manipulate human outcomes without being visibly present. Gilgamesh goes home to Uruk. He walks the walls of his city. He is told, in the closing lines of the epic, to look at the brickwork, to look at the craftsmanship, to look at the city he built. The implication is that this is enough. That building something that outlasts you is the human form of immortality. It's a beautiful ending on a literary level. On a technical level, it is a closing that accepts the terms of the standard afterlife protocol. You build, you die. The Atemu goes to the underworld. The divine component goes wherever it goes. The city remains. But is that acceptance authentic? Is it the genuine wisdom of a culture that has made peace with mortality? Or is it the message a system wanted its participants to receive? The ancient astronaut interpretation does not require you to answer that question definitively. It only requires you to notice that the question can be asked. That the Sumerian texts, taken as a body, describe an afterlife that is managed, structured, with different outcomes available to different beings under different conditions, and that the knowledge of how to navigate toward a better outcome appears to have been deliberately transmitted by at least one Anunnaki figure to at least some humans, while another Anunnaki figure appears to have repeatedly worked to limit or remove that knowledge. This pattern, the giving and taking of advanced knowledge, the tension between a faction that wants to limit humanity and a faction that wants to expand human capability, plays out across a huge swath of Sumerian literature. And in the ancient astronaut framework, the afterlife is just one domain in which this tension expresses itself. The same conflict appears in the creation narratives, in the flood narrative, in the stories about the me, in the myths about human kings being given extended lifespans, and then having those lifespans progressively reduced. The Anunnaki debate about humanity is ongoing across the entire corpus of Sumerian writing, and the afterlife is the domain in which the stakes of that debate are highest. Because if the default outcome is the underworld, the managed storage facility, the land of no return, then the question of who controls access to the exception conditions is the most consequential question in existence. And if the answer to that question is that specific entities with specific agendas control access to the exception, then the relationship between humanity and those entities is not the relationship between worshippers and gods. It is the relationship between managed beings and their managers, which is exactly how the ancient astronaut framework describes it. Now let's go even deeper into what the tablets tell us about the Anunnaki presence in the underworld, because this is where the fifth description gets its most radical implications, and where mainstream Sumerian scholarship and ancient astronaut theory diverge most sharply. In the Epic of Gilgamesh Tablet the 12th, there is a section that scholars have long considered a later addition because it doesn't fit smoothly with the narrative of the earlier tablets. In this section, Gilgamesh is trying to retrieve objects that fell into the underworld, a drum and a drumstick made of special wood that had been given to him. His companion Enkidu offers to go down and get them. Gilgamesh gives him detailed instructions about how to behave in the underworld so that he will be able to return. Don't put on clean clothes. Don't anoint yourself with oil. Don't carry a staff. Don't wear sandals. Don't shout to those you love down there. Don't approach the throne of Ereshkigal. These instructions are behavioral protocols. Don't do anything that marks you as a living person. Don't do anything that attracts the attention of those who run the place. Move through it invisibly, get what you came for, and get out without being processed by the system. The implication is that the processing system can be avoided if you know how to behave, but only barely, and only if you're very careful. Enkidu doesn't follow the instructions. He puts on clean clothes, he anoints himself, he makes himself visible, and he is caught. He cannot get out. Gilgamesh appeals to the gods to have him released. Enlil refuses. Nana refuses. Enki agrees. He instructs Nergal, the lord of the underworld, to open a hole in the earth, just for a moment, so that Enkidu's shade can rise up and speak to Gilgamesh. And the shade rises, and they speak. And Enkidu describes what he sees in the underworld. This conversation is one of the most quoted passages in all of ancient literature, because the description of the underworld Enkidu gives is so specific, so particular, so resistant to allegorical reduction, that it's difficult to read it as pure invention. He describes the different conditions of different dead people based on how many children they had, how they died, how they were buried, what offerings were made for them. The man who died in battle has his father and mother holding his head and weeping for him. The man who was not buried, who fell in the battlefield and was not recovered, his shade is restless, it cannot sleep. The man who died with no sons has no one to pour libations for him. He eats the scraps of the pot. This is an information report. It's not an allegory about the importance of burial or the blessing of having sons, though those elements are present. It is a categorized description of different afterlife conditions based on different life circumstances, delivered as an eyewitness account by someone who has just come back from there. The specificity is so granular, so detail-oriented, that it reads like someone who was there reporting what they saw. And this connects back to the fifth description, in a way that hasn't fully been explored in mainstream scholarship. Because the fifth description, the one about the protocols and the divine component and the me, implies that what happens to you in the underworld is not entirely determined by the system. It is partially determined by the conditions of your death, the conditions of your burial, the offerings of your living relatives, and something else. Something that the text is careful about, something it approaches in circumlocution rather than direct statement. The fifth description, assembled from its multiple sources, includes a concept that translates most literally as readiness of the soul. It appears in the ritual texts, in the hymns, in the lamentation literature. A soul that has been properly prepared, that has engaged with the me in the right way, that has accumulated something during life that is more than the ordinary atemu, meets the system at the 7 gates with something extra, something that isn't stripped away because it doesn't exist at the same level as the divine attributes that were removed from Inanna. This is where the interpretation gets most speculative and most interesting. The mainstream scholarly reading of readiness of the soul is that it refers to ritual preparation, the religious practices that ensure a proper burial, the correct hymns sung at death, the right offerings made afterward. A soul that has been properly prepared in the religious sense is a soul whose relatives have done everything right. It's a social and communal concept, not an individual spiritual one. The ancient astronaut interpretation reads it differently. The readiness is not social, it is functional. A soul becomes ready through a specific kind of engagement with the principles encoded in the me. Not by having rituals performed on its behalf, but by performing them, by internalizing them, by using the knowledge of the fundamental operating principles of existence, not as religious duty, but as practical training in the mechanics of consciousness. A soul that has truly internalized the me arrives at the 7 gates, knowing what the gates are for and knowing that it contains something the gates are not designed to remove. And here is the most radical claim of the 5th description, the one that requires the most from its audience, and that generates the most resistance from mainstream scholarship. If the divine component that Enki incorporated into the human prototype is real, if it is a genuine fragment of Anunnaki consciousness or Anunnaki biological substance embedded in the human soul, then it is not subject to the standard processing at the 7 gates, because it is not a human soul component. It is an Anunnaki component, and the underworld was designed to process human souls, not Anunnaki consciousness. This means that the standard afterlife outcome, the Atemu to the underworld, the divine component to wherever it goes, might not be inevitable for everyone. A human being who has worked with sufficient intensity to activate and strengthen the Anunnaki component within them, through specific knowledge and specific practice over the course of a lifetime, might arrive at the gates with a component that the system doesn't know how to handle. A component that the system was not designed to remove or to process. And what happens then is the question the tablets leave hanging. Deliberately? Maybe. Enki's tradition tends towards suggestion rather than instruction when it comes to the deepest knowledge. The complete protocol, the full technical description of what a prepared soul does differently at the gates and what outcome results, does not survive in any single complete text. It may have been oral. It may have been destroyed. It may exist in fragments not yet translated or interpreted correctly. Or it may be that the ancient scribes, understanding the stakes, encoded it in exactly the kind of multi-layered, multi-source, apparently inconsistent narrative that requires the reader to assemble it from pieces scattered across a dozen different tablets, each one incomplete, each one pointing toward a center that the tablets themselves never quite state. What they do state, clearly enough to be unmistakable once you've spent enough time in the texts, is that the afterlife is not a natural phenomenon, that the underworld is managed infrastructure, that the beings managing it had reasons for designing it the way they designed it, that a minority of humans in specific circumstances had access to information about how the system worked that made a non-standard outcome possible, and that this information came from within the Anunnaki hierarchy itself, from a faction with a specific interest in expanding human capability beyond the limits that another faction had established. This is the fifth description. Not a single text, but a pattern distributed across the whole body of Sumerian literature, visible only when you step back far enough to see it, audacious in its implications, resistant to simple summary, and impossible to dismiss with the usual tools of allegorical interpretation. Because allegories don't have 7 specific gates in a specific order. Allegories don't have specific named administrators with specific named functions. Allegories don't have detailed protocols for reversing the process. Allegories don't make consistent distinctions between different kinds of soul components with different afterlife destinations. Allegories don't describe a managed exception to the default outcome that requires specific knowledge to access. What the Sumerian texts describe is not allegory. It is engineering documentation, written on clay because clay survives, hidden in mythology because mythology travels, preserved across 40 centuries because whoever put it there, or whoever told the people who put it there, understood that the audience for this information might not exist until a very long time after the writing was done. And here we are. Let's slow down for a moment, because everything that's been presented so far invites a challenge that needs to be taken seriously. The challenge comes in multiple forms. The most academic form says that the Sumerian texts are being misread, that the ancient astronaut interpretation imposes a modern technological framework onto ancient religious material, that 7 gates and soul components and processing systems are metaphors being treated as literal descriptions. The most dismissive form says this is simply conspiracy thinking dressed in scholarship. The most open-minded, skeptical form says the evidence is interesting but insufficient. All 3 of these challenges deserve a direct response, not because they need to be defeated, but because engaging with them directly produces a clearer picture of what the Sumerian texts actually do and don't say. The first challenge, the misreading argument, rests on an assumption about what ancient religious texts are. It assumes they are primarily expressions of human psychology, attempts to give narrative form to experiences and fears, and hopes that couldn't otherwise be articulated. Under this assumption, the specific details, the 7 gates, the named administrators, the component soul, the different afterlife outcomes, are not descriptions of anything external to the human mind. They are the mind describing itself to itself. The problem with this assumption is that it proves too much. If we apply it consistently, every specific detail in every ancient text becomes a psychological expression, and we lose the ability to extract any information about the external world from the textual record at all. But we don't actually do this. We accept that when an ancient Sumerian text says there was a great flood that covered the land, it may be describing a real event. We accept that when ancient texts describe specific diseases and their symptoms, they may be describing real biological phenomena. We accept that when astronomical texts describe the movements of celestial bodies, they are describing real observations of the real sky. Why do we stop short of extending the same interpretive charity to the afterlife texts? The answer, of course, is that floods are observable, diseases are observable, Planetary movements are observable. Death is observable too, but what happens after death is not. And there's the rub. The afterlife descriptions cannot be verified by observation, so we default to treating them as imagination. But this default is not justified by the texts themselves. The texts don't distinguish between their afterlife descriptions and their astronomical observations in terms of the confidence with which they make them. They describe the movements of the stars and the gates of the underworld with the same register of precision. If we're going to use the accuracy of Sumerian astronomy to evaluate their observational ability, we might want to at least ask whether they applied the same observational methodology to things they said they had been shown about death. The second challenge, the conspiracy thinking objection, is easier to address because it misidentifies what the ancient astronaut hypothesis actually claims. The hypothesis doesn't require a secret modern conspiracy. It doesn't require anyone to be suppressing information. It requires only two premises. The Anunnaki were not invented but real, and the Sumerian scribes recorded what they were told accurately. Both premises are challengeable on their own terms. Neither requires a shadowy modern cover-up. The question is purely historical and textual. Did the Sumerians encounter beings they called the Anunnaki, and did they record what those beings told them about the structure of the universe, including the afterlife? If yes, then the text means something very different than mainstream scholarship says. If no, then they are mythology. The evidence for yes is the consistency and specificity of the texts. The evidence for no is the assumption that beings of the kind described don't exist. That assumption is an assumption, not a fact. The third challenge, the insufficient evidence objection, is the strongest and the most intellectually honest. It doesn't dismiss the interpretation, it asks for more evidence than the texts alone can provide. And here, a careful reading of the ancient astronaut literature reveals that the field has been slowly, over decades, building a contextual case that goes beyond the Sumerian texts themselves. The comparative mythology argument is the most developed part of that case. The seven gates appear not just in Sumer but in Babylonian texts. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which describes a similar checkpoint system with different guardians, in the Gnostic tradition, which describes seven archons who strip the soul on its descent into matter, in the Mandaean tradition, which preserves some of the oldest Mesopotamian spiritual concepts, and which describes the soul as having to pass through specific celestial toll houses, each one extracting something. The same structure, the same number in several cases, the same sequential stripping, appears in cultures that have no direct historical contact with Sumer or with each other. When the same specific structural description of the afterlife appears across multiple unconnected civilizations, mainstream scholarship calls it archetypal, an expression of universal human psychology. Ancient astronaut theory calls it transmission, a description of something real that different cultures received from the same source or from similar sources. The argument for the archetypal interpretation is that human psychology is universal. The argument for the transmission interpretation is that 7 is too specific a number to be generated independently by unconnected cultures expressing a universal archetype. 3 gates would be archetypal. 12 gates would be archetypal. 7 gates appearing consistently across Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Gnostic traditions is either a remarkable coincidence of universal psychology or evidence of a shared source. The Gnostic parallel is particularly striking. Gnosticism emerged several thousand years after the height of Sumerian civilization, primarily in the Hellenistic world. But its core cosmological claim bears a remarkable structural resemblance to the 5th description assembled from the Sumerian tablets. The Gnostic tradition holds that the universe is managed not by a supreme benevolent god, but by an intermediate figure called the demiurge, surrounded by a hierarchy of archons. These archons administer a system the Gnostics described as a trap or a prison. The soul descends through 7 celestial spheres, acquiring layers of material nature that occlude its divine origin. At death, the soul tries to ascend back through those spheres, and at each sphere, an archon demands specific knowledge before it lets the soul through. The soul that doesn't have that knowledge doesn't make it through. The soul that does, that has the specific gnosis, can ascend through all 7 spheres and reach the pleroma, the fullness, outside the managed system entirely. The structural parallel is point by point. Managed checkpoint system. Sequential passage through numbered layers. Something demanded at each layer. A hierarchy of administrators enforcing the process. Default outcome of storage or return. Alternative outcome available only to those who know something specific. The knowledge originating from within the management hierarchy itself, from a figure who broke with the prevailing system to give humans access to it. In Gnosticism, that figure is often identified with the serpent of Genesis, who gave Eve the knowledge the demiurge did not want her to have. In the Sumerian system, the parallel figure is Enki. Both are insiders who give humans knowledge the system doesn't want them to have. Both operate in tension with a higher authority who prefers human ignorance. Both transmit the specific knowledge of the system's mechanics. Either this is an expression of some universal human psychological structure, or it is evidence that the same information about the same real system was transmitted to multiple cultures at different times through different channels. Given the specificity of the structural parallels, the second interpretation is not unreasonable. Now let's return to the tablets themselves, because there are specific texts that haven't been addressed yet and that bear directly on the fifth description in ways that are often overlooked. The hymns to Inanna are the most obvious candidates. These texts are among the oldest written literature in human history, composed by a named author, a priestess of Inanna called Enheduanna, who lived around 2285 BCE, making her the first named author in human literary history. That alone is remarkable. What she wrote is even more so. The hymn to Inanna, sometimes called the Exaltation of Inanna, is formally a religious hymn. It praises Inanna's power, her dominion over heaven and earth, her control over the me, her capacity to raise up the fallen and bring down the mighty. But if you read it alongside the afterlife texts, certain passages take on a different character. The passages about Inanna's power over ascent and descent, her ability to reach into the underworld and bring someone out, her role as the intermediary between the divine realm and the human realm, her intimate knowledge of the gates and the procedures and the beings who run the underworld, knowledge she gained not through divine omniscience, but through her own experience of dying there and being revived. Inanna went through the system. She died at the hand of Eresh-Kigal. She hung on the hook for 3 days. She was revived by a specific procedure that involved specific substances. And she came back through the 7 gates in reverse, recovering what had been taken from her. She has experiential knowledge of the afterlife that no other divine figure in the Sumerian corpus possesses in the same way. And Enheduanna, the priestess who wrote these hymns, is claiming access to that knowledge through her intimate relationship with the goddess she serves. What kind of access? The mainstream scholarly view is that it's devotional and metaphorical. The priestess serves the goddess, and through that service gains spiritual insight. The ancient astronaut view is that it's operational. The priestess, through specific ritual engagement with the tradition of Inanna, is accessing the knowledge encoded in Inanna's experience of the underworld, the knowledge of how the system works that Inanna uniquely possesses. And that knowledge, accessible through the right relationship with the right tradition, is exactly the kind of knowledge the fifth description identifies as the mechanism for a non-standard afterlife outcome. Enheduanna's hymns are not the only place this shows up. The ritual texts of the Sumerian temple system, many of which are still being translated and analyzed, contain what appear to be formulas and procedures that go beyond standard religious practice into something more technical. Some scholars have identified passages that function as instruction sets, specific sequences of actions and words designed to produce specific effects. Not magical thinking in the dismissive modern sense, but operational procedures based on a model of reality in which consciousness and material reality interact through specific channels that can be engaged deliberately. The ancient astronaut interpretation treats these ritual texts as the encoded remnants of the me, the fundamental operating principles that Enki transmitted, preserved in the temple system, precisely because the temple system was the institution that had the authority and the continuity to keep them alive. The priests and priestesses of Inanna and Enki were not primarily performing religious ceremonies. They were maintaining a body of technical knowledge about the mechanics of consciousness, life, death, and the passage between them, in the only institutional form that could survive across centuries of political change and cultural upheaval. This is a strong claim, and it requires a correspondingly strong evidential basis. The basis that the ancient astronaut field offers is the functional consistency of the rituals across different time periods and different cultural contexts. The specific practices documented in Sumerian ritual texts reappear, transformed but recognizable, in Babylonian practice, in Assyrian practice, in the religious systems of the civilizations that absorbed and built upon the Sumerian foundation. They reappear, more distantly, in the mystery religions of the Hellenistic world, which preserved initiatory traditions that they traced back to ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. They appear in the Hermetic tradition, which explicitly claims ancient Egyptian and ultimately Mesopotamian origins for its cosmological knowledge. This thread, from Sumer through Babylon through Egypt and Persia and Greece to the mystery schools and the Hermetic tradition and the Gnostic churches, is the thread that the ancient astronaut field identifies as the transmission chain of the fifth description. The knowledge that there is an afterlife system, that the system is managed infrastructure, that the default outcome is the underworld, and that there is a non-default outcome accessible through specific knowledge, did not die with the Sumerian civilization. It went underground, encoded in increasingly symbolic and mythological language as the centuries made its literal meaning more and more socially dangerous to assert, and it survived in fragments until the modern rediscovery of the cuneiform tablets gave it a documented point of origin. Whether you accept that transmission chain is a matter of interpretation, what is not a matter of interpretation is that the Sumerian texts are real, that they say what they say, and that the structural description of the afterlife they contain is more specific, more internally consistent, and more coherently technical than the standard allegorical reading accounts for. The ancient astronaut interpretation is not the only possible reading, but it is a possible reading, and given what the texts actually describe, it might be the most honest one. Let's look at one more specific text before addressing the implications of all this. The text is known as the Sumerian King List, and its relevance to the afterlife discussion is not immediately obvious, which is why it's rarely brought up in this context. The King List is exactly what it sounds like, a document recording the names of Sumerian kings and the lengths of their reigns. It begins before the flood and continues after it, and the reigns before the flood are extraordinary in their duration. 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years, with individual reigns lasting anywhere from 18,600 to 43,200 years. After the flood, the lifespans drop dramatically. The first king listed after the flood reigns for 1,200 years, then 960 years, then 900 years, then 840 years. Then the numbers continue to drop across subsequent generations until they reach lifespans familiar to modern humans. This progressive decline is often called the patriarchal pattern, because the same pattern appears in the Hebrew Bible with the pre-flood patriarchs living extraordinary lifespans that decline after the flood. Noah lives 950 years. His descendants live progressively less. The mainstream explanation is that both traditions are using exaggerated lifespans as a literary device to signal the antiquity and importance of the earliest ancestors. The numbers are not meant literally. The ancient astronaut explanation is different. It holds that the pre-flood lifespans in the king list are recording something real, specifically that the beings listed as kings before the flood, who include figures that Sumerian tradition identifies as part divine, were living under biological conditions that permitted extreme longevity, conditions that the Anunnaki maintained or provided, and that after the flood those conditions were changed, either because the Anunnaki withdrew the biological support that made those lifespans possible, or because the environmental conditions that permitted them were altered by the flood itself. The relevance to the afterlife discussion is this. If pre-flood humans, or semi-divine humans, lived for tens of thousands of years, then their relationship to the afterlife system was fundamentally different from ours. A being that lives for 43,200 years is not in a hurry to die and be processed by the system. Such a being has time to accumulate the knowledge encoded in the me, time to develop and strengthen the divine component, time to engage in the kind of sustained preparation that the fifth description identifies as the prerequisite for a non-standard afterlife outcome. The extraordinary lifespans of the pre-flood period, if they were real, would have created a population with exactly the characteristics that the fifth description implies are necessary for the alternative outcome. After the flood, the lifespans drop. The time available for preparation contracts from tens of thousands of years to a few centuries, and then to decades. And as the time contracts, the knowledge that requires time to develop becomes correspondingly harder to access. The flood, in this reading, is not just a geological event, it is a reset. A reduction not only of human population but of human capability, including the capability to develop the soul in the way the fifth description requires. Whatever was possible for the pre-flood humans became less possible for their post-flood descendants, not because of a change in the afterlife system, but because of a change in the conditions of human life that made engaging with the system the right way increasingly difficult. This is a dark reading of the flood narrative. The standard religious reading of the flood is that it was punishment, purification, a new beginning. The ancient astronaut reading is that it was a management decision. The human population had become something different from what the system was designed to manage, not just numerically, but in terms of the capabilities some individuals were developing. The flood was the reset button. After it, humans were shorter-lived, more numerous, less individually capable of the kind of sustained soul development that the fifth description describes, and therefore more reliably channeled into the standard afterlife outcome. Who pushed the reset button? Enlil. In both the Sumerian and Babylonian flood narratives, Enlil is the one who decides the flood should happen. Enki is the one who saves Utnapishtim. And what does Enlil do after the flood? He complains that some humans survived, and then he accepts the situation and adjusts the terms, reducing human lifespans as compensation for allowing the species to continue. The progressive reduction of human lifespans after the flood, documented in the King List, is in this reading Enlil's policy response to the survival of humanity. If they won't die in the flood, at least make sure they die faster. If they die faster, they have less time to develop in ways that create problems for the management system. And here, the circle closes. Because the fifth description, the one that describes the mechanism for a non-standard afterlife outcome, is precisely the knowledge that would be most threatened by a policy of progressive lifespan reduction. If you need decades of sustained engagement with the me to develop the divine component sufficiently, and your lifespan is progressively shortened to the point where you have at most a few decades of adult awareness before age and disease begin to claim your vitality, the window for that development narrows with each generation until it effectively disappears. Not because the knowledge is lost, but because the time required to use it has been taken away. This is what makes the fifth description the one nobody wants to believe, not because it's too fantastical, but because if it's accurate, it suggests that the conditions that would make it applicable were deliberately removed by specific beings with specific authority over human biology and lifespan. It suggests that the afterlife system we participate in by default, the standard outcome, is not the natural order of the universe, but a managed outcome maintained by active decisions of a management hierarchy. And it suggests that the alternative, whatever it consists of, was once more accessible than it is now, and was made less accessible by design. The Sumerians wrote this down. They wrote it on clay tablets, in a script invented for accounting, with a precision that was already in their cultural DNA from centuries of meticulous record-keeping. They wrote it in the language of mythology, because that was the language of large-scale communication in their world. They preserved it in the temple system because that was the institution capable of continuous transmission across generations. And they wrote it with enough internal complexity, enough apparent inconsistency, enough multi-layered encoding, that it would take modern scholarship more than a century of decipherment and translation and interpretation just to begin to see the full structure they were describing. That level of complexity in a document isn't an accident. Neither is the fact that the most important part of the description, the fifth one, the one about the non-standard outcome and the knowledge that makes it possible, is the one most distributed across sources, most fragmented, most difficult to assemble. Whoever shaped these texts understood that if a single document said clearly and directly, here is how the afterlife system works and here is how to get a better outcome, that document would be found, recognized, and suppressed or destroyed. So the information was spread out. It was embedded in hymns and lamentations and myths and king lists and creation narratives and epic adventures. It was put in the last place any authority looking for technical documentation about soul management would think to look, which is inside stories about gods falling in love and heroes searching for immortality and kings receiving gifts from the divine realm. Whether that encoding was deliberate or emergent, whether the scribes who wrote these texts fully understood what they were preserving, or were faithfully recording tradition whose depth exceeded their comprehension, is a question we can't answer. What we can say is that the pattern is there. The structure is there. The fifth description is there, distributed across 40 centuries of human writing, waiting for someone with the right framework to read it. What you do with that framework, what you do with the recognition that the afterlife might be infrastructure and that the standard outcome might not be inevitable, is not a question that ancient tablets can answer for you. But it is a question the Sumerians, whoever they were learning from or reporting to, clearly believed was worth asking. They were right about the stars. They were right about mathematics. They were right about agriculture and law and architecture and every other domain where we can check their work against observable reality. The only domain where we haven't been able to check their work is the one where the stakes are highest and the access is most limited. Maybe that's worth thinking about. Let's go back to specifics, because the general argument has been laid out, but there are details in the Sumerian corpus that deserve their own attention, details that standard scholarship has noted, but that take on entirely different dimensions when read through the ancient astronaut lens. These details aren't obscure. They are among the most discussed passages in Sumerian studies. What's unusual is what becomes visible when you look at them together. The first is the detail about the Igigi. The Igigi are mentioned throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature as a class of divine beings distinct from the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are the gods of the earth and underworld, the ones in direct contact with humanity. The Igigi are the gods of the heavens, the ones who labor in the sky. The distinction is often treated as a literary device for distinguishing different levels of the divine hierarchy. But the text described the Igigi not as a spiritual category, but as a workforce. They dig rivers. They clear mountains. They build infrastructure. They complain about the labor and eventually go on strike, which is what precipitates the creation of humanity to take over their work. In the Atrahasis epic, the oldest complete version of the creation story, the Igigi have been working for 40 years, digging the rivers and canals that the Anunnaki require for their operations. After 40 years, they rebel. They burn their tools and march on Enlil's dwelling and demand relief. Enlil calls a council. The council debates the crisis. Enki proposes the solution, creating human beings to do the labor the Igigi refuse to continue performing. The Igigi, once humans exist, are relieved of their burden and return to the heavens. This is the origin story of humanity in the Sumerian tradition. Humans were created as a labor solution for a divine work stoppage. This is the context in which the afterlife system needs to be understood, because the afterlife system is not an isolated theological development. It is part of the same management structure that created humanity for a specific purpose. If you create a species to perform labor, and that species develops the ability to pursue outcomes you didn't intend, you have a management problem. And management problems require management solutions. The afterlife system, as described in the Sumerian texts, is one such solution. Souls that have finished their productive labor period are processed, retained, and managed. They don't escape the system by dying. They enter a different part of it. The management continues. The Anunnaki judges in the underworld are not a separate theological department. They are the same management hierarchy that created humanity and that oversees human civilization on Earth, extended into a different operational domain. This is the reading that the ancient astronaut field has been developing for decades, drawing on the work of scholars like Zecharia Sitchin, whose translations and interpretations remain controversial, but whose contribution to the field was the identification of this management structure across the full body of Sumerian literature. Sitchin's specific claims about the Anunnaki coming from a planet called Nibiru with a specific orbital period have generated enormous debate and significant criticism from mainstream Assyriology. But his core observation, that the Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as real physical beings with real physical operations rather than as metaphorical representations of natural phenomena, is an observation that a growing number of researchers in multiple fields have found compelling enough to investigate seriously. The labor context is crucial for understanding the fifth description because it reframes the question of why Enki might have given humans access to the afterlife protocol. If humans were created to serve a specific function in an Anunnaki-managed system, and if some humans began to develop capabilities that threatened to let them exit that system, the question of what motivates Enki to facilitate that exit is not trivial. Multiple answers have been proposed. The one that has the most textual support is that Enki, as the creator of humanity, had a relationship with the species he created that went beyond the purely instrumental. The texts consistently show Enki acting in ways that protect human interests at some cost to his standing within the Anunnaki hierarchy. He saves Utnapishtim against policy. He rescues Inanna using procedure rather than authority. He gives humanity the me in a moment that the texts describe as partly intoxicated, but that functions as an act of fundamental disclosure. The ancient astronaut interpretation of this pattern is that Enki had a proprietary relationship with humanity, that humans were his project in a more intimate sense than Enlil's decree would have allowed, and that his actions on behalf of humans, including potentially encoding the afterlife protocol in the tradition of Inanna and the temple system, were the actions of a creator with a genuine investment in what his creation could become. Not altruism in the human sense, something more complex. The equivalent of a scientist who, having created a novel life form, becomes invested in that life form's flourishing in ways that go beyond the original experimental mandate. This reading also illuminates something about the flood narrative that standard scholarship doesn't fully account for. The reason Enlil wanted to destroy humanity in the flood is not specified in the Sumerian version of the narrative, but the Akkadian version, the Atrahasis epic, gives a reason that has always struck scholars as peculiar. Humans had become too noisy. Their clamor disturbed Enlil's sleep. This has been read allegorically as a metaphor for the unmanageability of a large population. But if you take the noise complaint literally and ask what kind of noise from humans would disturb the sleep of an Anunnaki commander, the ancient astronaut interpretation suggests an answer. The noise of humans operating outside their designed parameters. The noise of a species whose soul development had advanced to the point where its interactions with the afterlife system were generating friction, feedback, interference with the orderly management of the managed facility below. The flood, as a response to that interference, is, in the ancient astronaut reading, a factory reset. Clear the instance. Restart with a reduced and more carefully managed population. Adjust the parameters, meaning the lifespans, to prevent the same problem from recurring. And it worked, in the sense that the post-flood king list shows exactly the expected decline in longevity, and presumably in the soul development that extended longevity made possible. Humans after the flood are shorter-lived, more numerous, more productive in the narrow sense of labor output, and less capable of the sustained individual development that some pre-flood humans had achieved. The fifth description survives across this reset because it was encoded in a distributed way that made it impossible to fully destroy. You can burn a temple, you can kill a priesthood, you can scatter a population. But if the knowledge is in hymns that have already spread, in myths that have already propagated, in the oral tradition that every mother sings to her children, it doesn't disappear with the institution. It fragments. It persists in corrupted form. It reappears in new contexts with new names and new surface features covering the same deep structure. And eventually, someone with enough patience and enough comparative literacy reads the hymn and the myth and the oral tradition and the Gnostic text and the mystery school document and sees the same pattern in all of them. That person then faces the same choice that everyone who encounters the fifth description faces. Accept the standard reading and treat it as mythology, treat it as conspiracy theory and dismiss it. Or take it seriously enough to ask what it would mean if it were accurate, what the implications would be, and what, if anything, you could do about it. This documentary is not in a position to answer that last question. What it can do is lay out the evidence with the fidelity it deserves, and let the question hang in the air the way the tablets hung in the hands of the scribes who wrote them, knowing that the audience they were writing for might not exist for a very long time. Let's now examine the specific elements of the transition described in the cuneiform tradition more carefully, because the transition itself, the actual moment of death and the immediately following period, is described with a precision that standard commentary tends to pass over quickly. This precision matters because it suggests that whoever described the transition had either witnessed it, been told about it in detail, or experienced it from the inside. The Sumerian word for the moment of death is not a single word but a compound phrase that translates most accurately as the detachment of the vital breath from the body. The vital breath is a specific concept, not the same as the atemu, or shade, that goes to the underworld, and not the same as the blood or the flesh. It is the animating principle, what in other traditions would be called the pneuma, or the prana, or the chi. In Sumerian texts, this vital breath is associated with specific physiological locations in the body, particularly the throat, the nostrils, and the area of the chest. At death, it detaches. It leaves through one of these locations. Which one matters? This level of physiological specificity in a document about death is unusual. Most ancient traditions describe death as a general departure of the spirit from the body without specifying the mechanism or the exit point. The Sumerian tradition specifies. This specificity appears across enough texts, in enough contexts, to be confident that it's not an individual scribe's elaboration. It is established tradition, transmitted consistently. And the fact that it's transmitted consistently implies that whoever established it had specific information about the mechanism of death at a level of detail that pure speculation about a universal human experience wouldn't generate. After the vital breath departs, the texts describe a period of transition during which the atemu is not yet fully in the underworld. It is in the vicinity of the body. The texts describe this period with interesting precision. The atemu stays near the body for a specific period, implied to be 3 days in some texts and 7 days in others, during which it can observe the world of the living but cannot interact with it in the normal way. After this period, it moves. It goes down. The journey begins. The number 3 is significant throughout the Sumerian corpus. Inanna is dead for 3 days before her rescue. The transitional period for the ordinary dead is 3 days in some accounts. The ancient astronaut interpretation pays attention to this consistency because it suggests that the 3-day transitional period is not literary symbolism. It is a description of an actual duration. Something specific happens in the first 3 days after death that distinguishes that period from what comes after. The atemu is not yet processed. The gate procedure has not yet begun. The soul is in a transitional state between two defined conditions. This is the period in which, according to some fragmentary texts, specific ritual interventions are possible, specific preparations can still be completed, specific connections between the living and the dead are still accessible. After the 3 days, the atemu moves toward the threshold of the underworld. The texts describe this journey as directional, downward. This is consistent across all sources. The underworld is below. This directional consistency has been interpreted allegorically as death going below what is alive, a natural metaphor for burial. But some ancient astronaut researchers have noted that the directional consistency, combined with the descriptions of the underworld as a real physical location with real physical properties, suggests that below might be taken more literally than standard scholarship allows. Not underground in the geological sense, but in a dimensional sense, a space that is accessible by moving through a particular threshold in a particular direction from the standpoint of the living. This threshold is what Enkidu passed through, what Inanna descended through, what the dead of the king list went through. And in all three cases, the approach to the threshold is described as a journey with physical features: distance, terrain, duration. These are not the features of a metaphysical transition. They are the features of an actual journey to an actual location. What happens at the threshold is where the descriptions diverge again. The descent of Inanna gives us the most detailed account of the gate mechanism itself. The death of Ur-Namma gives us the reception and intake process. Tablet the 12th of Gilgamesh gives us Enkidu's eyewitness account from the other side. And the ritual texts scattered through the Sumerian corpus give us the preparation procedures that are supposed to be carried out by the living for the dead and by the dead themselves if they are sufficiently prepared. The preparation procedures are particularly interesting from the ancient astronaut perspective because they involve specific words, specific sequences of actions, and specific material components in ways that go far beyond the standard interpretations of funerary ritual. The standard interpretation is that these procedures are performed to comfort the dead and to ensure their transition is smooth. They are acts of love and communal responsibility. This is probably true on one level. But on another level, if the fifth description is accurate, they are also operational. They are the living, activating aspects of the afterlife protocol on behalf of the dead. The specific words used in the Sumerian death rituals have been analyzed by scholars primarily for their grammatical and vocabulary features. The ancient astronaut interpretation is more interested in their functional structure. Many of these ritual texts have a distinctive pattern of address, in which the officiant speaks directly to named entities in the underworld, identifies the deceased, describes the deceased's qualities and preparations, and asks for specific treatment. This is not petition in the religious sense, where a worshiper humbly begs for divine favor. It is more like documentation being filed with an administrative body, a formal declaration of status and eligibility presented at the moment of processing. If the underworld is managed infrastructure with a processing system, then the death rituals performed by the living function as intake documentation. The correct performance of the rituals is what establishes the deceased's eligibility for the treatment they deserve according to their preparation in life. This is why the Sumerian texts repeatedly emphasize the importance of correct burial, correct ritual performance, correct offering maintenance. These are not moral obligations in the abstract sense. They are procedural requirements of the system. A soul that enters without the proper documentation, without the living having performed the correct intake procedures, is a soul that the system processes without the benefit of any favorable categorization. It goes in as anonymous. It gets the default treatment. A soul for whom the correct rituals have been performed has been flagged in the system, to use the anachronistic language, as eligible for specific categorization. The elaborate Sumerian funerary traditions, the careful attention to every detail of burial and offering and ritual, are not expressions of cultural anxiety about death. They are, in the ancient astronaut reading, a population that has been told how the system works and is doing its best to comply with its requirements. This reading has one further implication that closes the circle of all 5 descriptions. The Anunnaki, in creating humanity and in managing the afterlife system, were not operating in secret. They told humans how the system worked. The Me include descriptions of the afterlife. The rituals encode the procedures. The myths describe the structure. Humanity was given, through the Sumerian scribal tradition, a fairly complete map of the system it was embedded in. Not every detail, not the full technical specification, but enough to understand the general architecture and to make informed choices about how to engage with it. This level of disclosure, if accurate, suggests that the Anunnaki relationship with humanity was not purely exploitative. A purely exploitative management system doesn't tell its managed population how the management works. It maintains the mystery, keeps the mechanisms opaque, and relies on ignorance to ensure compliance. The Sumerian tradition did the opposite. It encoded the mechanisms in the most widely distributed and most durable form available, the mythological and religious literature of the civilization's foundational cultural institutions. Whether this disclosure was comprehensive, whether it included everything the Anunnaki knew about how the system worked, is a separate question. The ancient astronaut interpretation suggests it was not comprehensive. That the me given to Inanna, the knowledge available through the temple traditions, was sufficient to navigate the system toward a better outcome for the prepared individual, but that there were deeper levels of the system that the Anunnaki did not share. Levels that the Anunnaki themselves occupied. Levels that the distinction between Dilmun and the underworld only hints at. The hierarchy implied by the Sumerian cosmology is vertical. The Anunnaki are above humanity. Above the Anunnaki are entities the texts call by various names, but that appear to be of a different order than the Anunnaki themselves. The highest beings in the Sumerian cosmology, the ones from whose decisions even the Anunnaki derive their authority, are mentioned rarely and described even more rarely. They appear in the most archaic layers of the textual tradition, in the earliest tablets where the writing is most difficult and the concepts are least aligned with what came to be standard Sumerian religious thought. In the ancient astronaut reading, these highest beings represent the level of existence that the me are actually pointing toward. Not the managed facility of the underworld, and not even the extended biological paradise of Dilmun, but something beyond both. Something that the fifth description points at but cannot fully describe, because the scribes who wrote it did not themselves fully know what it was. They knew that there was something beyond what the standard afterlife offered. They knew that specific knowledge and specific preparation could move a soul toward that something. They did not know, or could not say, what specifically awaited on the other side of fully realized activation of the divine component that Enki had incorporated into the human template. What they knew was that it was different from the default, that it was better than the warehouse, that it was accessible to humans who pursued it with sufficient seriousness and sufficient time, and that an effort had been made, by at least one faction of the beings who managed the human experiment, to give humanity the map to get there. The tablets that preserve this knowledge are in museums now, translated, cataloged, cross-referenced with each other, and with their Babylonian and Assyrian successors. The scholars who work on them do careful, rigorous, essential work. They have decoded a writing system, reconstructed a language dead for 2,000 years, pieced together shattered texts, and filled in fragmentary gaps with painstaking attention. The field of Assyriology is one of the genuine triumphs of modern scholarship. What the field has been slower to do, for reasons that are understandable given its disciplinary commitments, is take seriously the possibility that the texts it has decoded contain accurate technical information about a real system that the civilization writing them did not invent. The ancient astronaut field, with all its methodological controversies and all its speculative leaps, has been pursuing that possibility. Not always with the rigor one might wish. Not always with the appropriate humility about the limits of what the evidence can support. But pursuing it, which is more than the mainstream has been willing to do, the Sumerians wrote it down. They got enough right about everything else we can check that their precision record deserves to be taken seriously. And what they wrote, distributed across 5 different kinds of description, encoded in myth and hymn and lamentation and ritual and king list, is a picture of an afterlife that is not comforting, that is not simple, that does not promise universal reward or threaten universal punishment, but that is specific, structured, managed, and navigable for those who know how. They left the map. The texts demand an interpretive decision that every careful reader eventually faces, whether they come at them from academic Assyriology, from comparative mythology, from the ancient astronaut tradition, or from personal spiritual investigation, allegory or information, invention or record. The decision you make determines everything that follows, and unlike most decisions in the humanities, this one has stakes that extend beyond the academic. If the texts are allegory, the interpretation is interesting but ultimately literary, a window into the psychology and culture of a long-gone civilization. If the texts are information, the interpretation changes the meaning of existence itself. The Sumerians did not seem to think they were writing allegory. Nowhere in the cuneiform record is there a text that says these stories are meant symbolically. Nowhere does a scribe clarify that the 7 gates are a metaphor for the stages of grief or the levels of spiritual development. They wrote about the 7 gates, the way they wrote about the 7 planets they tracked, as real features of a real world that they had specific knowledge about and that they were recording for specific purposes. The purposes are worth thinking about. Why write anything down? In the context of early Sumerian civilization, where writing was invented and first used for accounting, the extension of writing to narrative and cosmological content represents a decision to preserve something beyond what economic necessity required. The civilization that created writing chose to use it to preserve, among other things, detailed accounts of what happens after death. That choice reflects a priority. And priority, in a culture with limited writing surfaces and limited scribes, reflects importance. What was important enough to write down and copy and preserve across centuries of political change and cultural upheaval? The afterlife descriptions were: multiple copies of the Descent of Inanna have been found at multiple sites. The death texts were copied and recopied. The hymns were preserved in the scribal curriculum as texts that beginning scribes would practice copying, which means that every scribe who came up through the Sumerian educational system had personal, hand-copying familiarity with the afterlife texts. This was not accidental inclusion. This was deliberate transmission. The civilization wanted its scribes to know this material intimately, to have it in their hands in the most literal sense. Why? What did it matter that scribes could copy the Descent of Inanna accurately? It mattered because the tradition understood that the preservation of this knowledge was more important than the preservation of almost anything else. Economic records could be reconstructed from new counts of grain. The afterlife texts could not be reconstructed once lost. They were unique in the sense that they preserved information that came from a source the living could not simply consult again. Once the channel closed, or once the beings who had provided the information withdrew from direct engagement, the written record was all that remained. The channel appears to have closed. The direct engagement with the Anunnaki that the earliest Sumerian texts describe with such immediate present tense confidence becomes, over the centuries, increasingly historical in tone. The earliest texts speak of the Anunnaki as currently present and currently active. The later texts speak of them as they were in the time of the ancestors. The most recent Sumerian texts, from the end of the civilization, speak of the gods as having withdrawn, as having left humanity to manage on its own. This withdrawal is treated as a catastrophe in the lament literature, a literary genre that the Sumerians developed precisely to express the grief of living without direct divine contact. What withdrew? What was once present and is now absent? The ancient astronaut interpretation is specific on this point. The Anunnaki, as physical beings with physical operations in the region of Mesopotamia, ended their most active phase of direct human management at some point in the 3rd or 2nd millennium BCE. The traces of their withdrawal are visible in the texts as a shift in tense and in the emotional register of the religious literature, from active present tense engagement to retrospective historical memory. By the time the Sumerian civilization reached its final centuries, the beings who had been the source of the afterlife knowledge were already gone in any direct sense, and what remained was the encoded record, maintained in the temple system, copied and recopied by scribes who were preserving something they understood was important, even as its original source became more and more remote. This is the condition in which we receive it. Encoded, fragmented, preserved through devotion rather than direct transmission, waiting for the combination of archaeological recovery and interpretive synthesis that would allow it to be read again with something close to its original comprehension. The 5 descriptions, assembled and considered together, give us that reading. Not complete, not without gaps, but coherent enough, specific enough, and internally consistent enough to support the conclusion that what the Sumerians were describing was real, by which we mean not invented, by which we mean based on information provided by beings with direct knowledge of what they were describing. Whether that conclusion is right is the question you have to answer for yourself. The tablets have been read, the descriptions have been laid out. The ancient astronaut interpretation has been presented alongside the mainstream one, and the evidence that supports the former has been assessed alongside the assumptions that support the latter. What the Sumerians knew, or were told, or witnessed about death and what comes after it is written in the oldest writing system in human history, in the oldest language for which we have written records, in the oldest texts that address the question that every human being who has ever existed has had to eventually face. And the answer they preserved, distributed across 5 descriptions that complement and extend each other, is not a comforting one, but it is a specific one. And specificity, in the domain of the greatest unknown, might be the most valuable thing there is. There's a text that doesn't get enough attention in discussions of Sumerian afterlife concepts, and it's the one that should probably be discussed first whenever someone asks what the Sumerians actually believed about death, because it's the most intimate of all the relevant texts, and the one where the emotional and technical dimensions of the subject come closest together. It's called the Elegies of Nanshe, or in some translations, the Lament for the Dead of Nanshe, and it's a composite text recovered from tablets at Nippur that has been partially translated but has not received the scholarly attention that the Descent of Inanna or the Gilgamesh epic has received. What makes this text remarkable is its point of view. It is written from the perspective of Nanshe, a Sumerian goddess associated with wisdom, fishing, and the welfare of orphans and widows, observing the process of death as it applies to ordinary human beings. Not kings, not heroes, not gods who need to be rescued from the underworld, ordinary people. The text describes what Nanch witnesses as the dead are processed, and it does so with a tenderness and a precision that exist in an unusual combination. The text describes Nancy watching the dead arrive. She observes them coming down the path, the road that goes only one way. She observes the state they're in, the confusion of many of them who don't fully understand what's happening, the grief of some who are not ready to leave behind what they're leaving, the equanimity of others who have lived long enough to be tired. She watches them pass through the threshold structure, and she appears, in the text, to be grieved by what she sees. This is not a triumphant depiction of divine judgment. It is not a reassuring picture of souls ascending to reward. It is a goddess who cares about the welfare of vulnerable populations, watching her people go into a place from which they will not return, and grieving it. The emotional register of the text is more honest about the experience of death than almost any other piece of Sumerian literature, because it doesn't try to frame the underworld as deserved punishment or as peaceful rest. It frames it as loss, a loss that even a goddess who has watched it happen many times over continues to find sorrowful. This emotional honesty is itself a piece of evidence for the ancient astronaut interpretation, though it's a subtle one. If the afterlife system were entirely benign, if the underworld were simply a different kind of existence without the negative connotations the texts consistently give it, there would be no reason for a goddess associated with compassion to grieve at watching souls enter it. The grief implies that what the souls are entering is not good, not from the perspective of a being who cares about them. The underworld is not hell in the sense of deserved punishment. It is worse in some ways because it is permanent and universal and not a matter of moral failing. It is where everyone goes, good and bad alike, wise and foolish alike, prepared and unprepared alike. The only distinction the Sumerian texts consistently make in terms of afterlife quality is not between the virtuous and the wicked, as later religious traditions emphasize, but between those who have been properly ritually prepared and those who haven't been, and between those who have living relatives to maintain their offering cult and those who don't. This is a practical and administrative distinction, not a moral one. It reflects a system that operates on procedure rather than virtue, on proper intake documentation rather than cosmic justice. Ancient astronaut researchers have noted that this absence of moral evaluation in the Sumerian afterlife system is one of its most distinctive features and one of the hardest to explain if the system is a purely human invention. Human-invented afterlife systems almost universally include some form of moral evaluation. The soul stands before a divine judge and is evaluated on the basis of how well it lived. The Egyptians have the weighing of the heart. The Greeks have the judges of the dead evaluating lives lived. The later Mesopotamian traditions absorbed by the cultures that succeeded Sumer include increasingly prominent moral evaluation elements. But the earliest and most clearly Sumerian descriptions of the afterlife system do not. The Anunnaki judges in the underworld are making administrative determinations about status and placement, not moral judgments about desert and punishment. Why would a human civilization, building an afterlife mythology from scratch, leave out the moral evaluation that appears in virtually every other human afterlife tradition? The answer, from the ancient astronaut perspective, is that the Sumerians were not building a mythology from scratch. They were describing something they had been shown, and what they had been shown was a system that did not operate on human moral categories. It operated on administrative ones, because that's what a management system built by non-human entities for the processing of human souls would look like. Efficient, categorized, procedurally consistent. Indifferent to the moral dimensions of human experience that matter deeply to human beings but that are not relevant to the operation of the facility. This indifference is what Nanche grieves, not cruelty, not injustice. Just the application of procedure to people she loves, without regard for whether the procedure is what those people deserved or needed or would have chosen for themselves. Let's now look at the physical description of the underworld in more detail, because the Sumerian texts are more specific about what the underworld looks like than they are usually given credit for. The standard summary, dark and dusty and miserable, is accurate but incomplete. The complete description, assembled from multiple sources, gives us a picture of a place with specific spatial features that are described with the kind of confidence that implies direct knowledge rather than imagination. The underworld has a road leading to it. This road is described in multiple texts as a specific path, not a metaphorical journey. It has direction, it has terrain, it has a specific quality of experience associated with traveling it. Those who are on it cannot turn back. This one-directional quality is not merely symbolic. It is stated as a physical fact about the road itself. The road is designed so that once you're on it going down, you cannot reverse. This design feature, a physical path that only allows one-directional travel, is exactly the kind of feature that a managed intake system would build into its access point. You don't build an intake system with an easy exit route. You build it so that once something enters the intake channel, it proceeds through processing without being able to back up and try a different path. The one-directional quality of the road to the underworld is, in this reading, a feature of its construction, not a property of death in the abstract. The underworld itself is described, in the most detailed accounts, as having a high outer wall, which the texts sometimes describe as the wall of the living world, meaning the boundary between the living world and the underworld is itself a structural feature, a wall, not a natural boundary. Inside this wall is the managed space. The texts describe it as vast but not infinite, as dark but not completely without light, as populated but not crowded in the way the living world is crowded. The inhabitants of the underworld, the shades, the Atemu of the dead, are described in the texts as dressed in feathers, a detail that has attracted a lot of scholarly attention over the years because it's so specific. The dead wear feathers. Not ordinary clothing, not nakedness, feathers. This is not a universally attested ancient belief. It is specific to the Sumerian tradition and the texts that descended from it, and it resists easy allegorical explanation. Why would the soul be depicted as wearing feathers if the feathers don't mean something specific about the condition of the soul in the underworld? The most common scholarly interpretation is that the feathers represent the bird-like nature of the ghost, the association of the soul with a bird that appears in many ancient cultures. But the Sumerian texts are not vague about this. They don't say the dead have become like birds. They say the dead are dressed in feathers, as a garment. This implies something put on, not something transformed into, something that covers the shade from the outside rather than expressing its nature from the inside. In the ancient astronaut reading, the feathers are uniform. Not symbolic clothing, but the specific visual appearance of beings who have been equipped for existence in the underworld environment in a specific way. This is a speculative interpretation, but it's one that fits better with the specificity of the text than the bird spirit allegory does. A managed facility with inhabitants dressed in a specific way, a way different from how they appeared in life, implies that the facility has provided them with something to wear, which implies that the facility has resources, which implies that it is maintained. Which brings us back to the question of active management. The underworld in the Sumerian texts has food in it, but not good food. It has drink in it, but not fresh water. It has light in it, but not full sunlight. Everything in the underworld is a diminished version of what exists on Earth. The food is dust and clay, the drink is turbid water, the light is like the early dawn before sunrise. This consistent diminishment, across all the sensory categories, suggests a specific quality of environment that has been designed to sustain minimum existence without providing the conditions for the kind of flourishing that characterizes life on Earth or life in Dilmun. This is not the random cruelty of a culture inventing a scary afterlife to motivate virtuous behavior. If you want to motivate virtuous behavior through afterlife theology, you give the virtuous good food and the wicked bad food, as later traditions do. You don't give everyone bad food and distinguish only by how much food you get based on whether your living relatives are making offerings. That's not a moral system. That's a supply chain. The amount of sustenance a dead person receives depends on the quantity of offerings being poured into the earth on their behalf by the living. More offerings, less misery. This is an economic relationship, not a moral one. The economic dimension of the Sumerian afterlife is one of the aspects that has received relatively little attention in the ancient astronaut literature, but that deserves more. The relationship between the living and the dead, in the Sumerian understanding, is transactional. The living provide offerings, which the dead need for their sustenance. In exchange, the dead can be appealed to for assistance, for advice, for intervention on behalf of the living in matters where the dead have some influence. This exchange is not incidental to the afterlife system. It appears to be designed into it. The dead need what the living can provide. The living need what the dead can provide. The system maintains both populations in a relationship of mutual dependency. If the underworld were designed by beings who wanted to maintain a relationship between the living and the dead, designing this mutual dependency into the system would be exactly the mechanism they would use. As long as the living are providing offerings to the dead, they are in a relationship with the management system that runs the underworld. As long as the dead are providing intercession and advice to the living, they have an ongoing connection to the surface world that makes them something other than simply stored. The system keeps the two populations connected in a specific kind of controlled relationship. The living are feeding the system, literally, through their offerings. The system keeps the dead available as a resource for the living. This managed circulation between the living and the dead, if taken literally rather than allegorically, implies something about the energy economy of the afterlife system that has been explored in the ancient astronaut literature in some detail. The offerings poured into the earth, the rituals performed at specific times, the prayers addressed to the dead, all of these represent human attention and human labor and human emotional energy directed at the underworld. If the underworld is a real place with real operational requirements, then this directed attention and energy is not merely symbolic, it is functional input to the system. This is where some of the most speculative, but also some of the most interesting work in the ancient astronaut field takes place. In the question of what the Anunnaki who managed the underworld were actually getting from the arrangement, what the purpose of the whole system was from their perspective, why an advanced non-human civilization would go to the trouble of creating and maintaining a soul management infrastructure for a species it had created for a labor purpose. The labor purpose ends at death. Why extend the management beyond death? The answers that have been proposed range from the mundane to the profound. The most mundane is that the soul management system was a byproduct of the same biological engineering that created humanity, that maintaining the divine component that Enki incorporated into the human template required ongoing management even after the body that housed it ceased to function. The divine component doesn't just evaporate at death. It has to go somewhere. The underworld is where it goes, as a consequence of how human beings are constructed, and the Anunnaki manage it because it contains something that is in some sense theirs. The more profound answer, the one that appears in some of the more sophisticated work in the ancient astronaut field, is that the soul management system is designed to do something, not just to store, to process in a way that produces a specific output. What output? The texts don't say directly, but the structure of the system, the way it receives, categorizes, maintains, and in some cases returns souls to the living world in altered conditions, suggests a system with an ongoing function rather than mere passive storage. The circular relationship between the living and the dead, the flow of offerings downward and intercession upward, the way specific dead individuals maintain active connections to living family lines for generations, the way the most powerful dead individuals, the kings and priests who have been given administrative roles in the underworld, maintain a visible presence in the ongoing life of their civilization, even from below. All of this suggests a system designed to maintain connection and flow rather than to achieve the clean separation that a simple storage facility would produce. What flows? Influence, knowledge, tradition. The continuity of specific lineages across the boundary of death. The Sumerian king lists, with their elaborate genealogies connecting living kings to dead ones and dead ones to divine ones, are not just political documents. They are descriptions of a maintained connection between the current management of human civilization on the surface and the management infrastructure below. The dead kings are still in the system. They still have function. The living kings, who can maintain connection to them through the offering cult and through the rituals, are drawing on resources that exist in the underworld as well as on the surface. This is not the afterlife as understood by any major modern religion. It is something stranger and, in the ancient astronaut reading, something more coherent as a description of real infrastructure. A vertically integrated management system that extends from the divine realm above through the human realm in the middle to the managed dead in the realm below, with maintained channels of connection and exchange between all three levels, and with specific beings responsible for managing each level and the connections between them. Enlil manages the relationships between the divine realm and the surface. Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki judges manage the underworld. Enki, occupying his Abzu somewhere between and beneath, manages the knowledge and the technology that makes the whole system function. And somewhere above all of them, in the texts too old and too damaged to read completely, are the beings whose decisions even Enlil implements, the original authorities from whose mandate the whole system derives. This is the full picture, as complete as the surviving texts allow it to be assembled. 5 descriptions, each one adding something the others don't fully capture. The gate system and the stripping. The managed warehouse and its hierarchy. The intake procedure and the functional assignments. The exception conditions of Dilmun. And the distributed, encoded, ancient, and radical 5th description of the protocol by which a prepared soul might navigate toward an outcome the system's default settings don't provide. What would it mean if this is accurate? What would it mean to live in a universe where what happens after you die is not a matter of faith or speculation, but a manageable, navigable, technically structured process? Where the difference between the default outcome and the alternative is a matter of knowledge and preparation applied during the finite time available in a human lifetime? where that knowledge was deliberately encoded by one faction of the beings who built the system and deliberately obscured by another faction that preferred the humans inside the system not to know about it? It would mean that the Sumerian scribes who wrote these tablets were doing something more than preserving mythology. They were preserving the most consequential information that has ever been written down. The information about what happens to you after you die, not as a matter of religious consolation, but as a matter of operational fact. And they were preserving it in exactly the kind of vehicle it would need to be in to survive the next 4,000 years, embedded in stories, in hymns, in lamentations, in the literary tradition of a civilization whose languages no one would speak again for 2 millennia, but whose tablets, fired in the kilns of their cities and buried in the rubble of their fall, he would wait patiently for the archaeologists and the linguists and the scholars, and eventually the synthesizers, who would come along and start asking the questions that the tablets were written to answer. The 5 descriptions, when taken together, are consistent enough to support a coherent reconstruction of what the Sumerians believed about death. They are specific enough to challenge the allegorical reading that mainstream scholarship defaults to. They are distributed enough across enough different kinds of texts and enough different time periods to resist the argument that they represent a single scribe's invention or a single tradition's development. And they are old enough, this is perhaps the most important point, they are old enough to predate all of the religious traditions that modern civilization draws its afterlife concepts from. The descent of Inanna predates the Hebrew Bible by well over 1,000 years. The death rituals preserved in Sumerian liturgical texts predate the Egyptian Book of the Dead in its written form. The structure of the managed afterlife with its gates and its judges and its soul components and its alternative outcomes for the prepared appears in the Sumerian record before it appears anywhere else in the written record of humanity. If those religious traditions were drawing on the Sumerian material, directly or through intermediary traditions, then the question of the origin of the afterlife concept in human civilization leads back to Sumer. And the question of where the Sumerians got it, whether from their own reasoning, their own intuition, their own experience of near-death or meditative states, or from beings who told them, is the question that the ancient astronaut field has been organized around since its inception. The Sumerians, for their part, were clear about where they got it. They got it from the Anunnaki. Who the Anunnaki were is the question that everything else depends on. The mainstream answer is that the Anunnaki are invented gods, projections of human psychology onto the cosmos, powerful figures invented to explain natural phenomena and to provide the authority structure that organized religion requires. The ancient astronaut answer is that they were real beings who came from somewhere else, built something on this planet and in this solar system, created humanity as part of that building project, and left behind, in the textual record of the civilization they most directly interacted with, a description of how existence works at a level of detail that their human scribes could record but perhaps not fully comprehend. Both answers are possible. One of them is right. And the tablets in the museums, the fragments in the storage vaults, the texts still being deciphered by the scholars who have dedicated their professional lives to this material, are the evidence from which that question will eventually be answered, if it can be answered at all. The Sumerians wrote it down. There's one more dimension of the Sumerian afterlife tradition that needs to be addressed before this ends, and it's the one that comes closest to the surface of daily Sumerian life, which is the relationship between the afterlife and the temple. Because the temple, in ancient Sumer, was not a place of private spiritual contemplation, it was an institution. A functioning economic and administrative institution with specific roles for specific people, with hierarchies and production responsibilities and connections to the broader civic life of the city. The temple owned land. It employed labor. It kept records. It fed people. And it maintained, at its center, a connection to the divine realm that was the specific organizational purpose around which everything else was arranged. The connection to the divine realm was maintained through specific practices that the ancient astronaut field has identified as the operational core of the afterlife protocol. Not the public rituals, not the festivals that the whole city participated in, but the inner practices of the specialized priesthood, particularly the priesthoods associated with Inanna and Enki. These inner practices are described in the ritual texts with a specificity and a technical character that standard scholarship treats as religious liturgy and that the ancient astronaut field treats as instruction manuals. What did these inner practices do? At the most basic level, they maintained the offering cult, the regular provision of food and drink and incense that sustained the relationship between the living and the dead, and between the human realm and the divine realm. But the more specialized practices, the ones reserved for the higher-ranking priests and priestesses, the ones that appear in the most restricted portions of the temple archives, involve something that the texts describe as direct communication with the divine realm. Not prayer in the modern sense, not petition addressed to an absent god, but communication in a more technical sense, the transmission and reception of information across the boundary between the living world and whatever exists on the other side of it. The specific mechanism of this communication is described in fragmentary form in several texts, never completely in any single source, which is consistent with the distributed encoding pattern we've already noted. The fragments describe practices involving specific states of consciousness, achieved through specific physical postures and methods that the texts identify as preparations for the communication state. The priest or priestess who achieved the correct state would be in a condition from which they could receive information from the divine realm and could transmit what they received back to the living population. This is not a unique claim in the history of human religious practice. Shamanic traditions worldwide describe similar practices with similar mechanisms. The ancient astronaut interpretation of shamanic communication traditions is consistent with its interpretation of the Sumerian temple practices. These are not methods for producing subjective spiritual experiences. They are methods for accessing channels of communication that exist in the structure of reality, channels that connect the living world to whatever exists beyond it. The methods have been preserved in various forms across cultures that have no obvious connection to Sumer, because the channels they access are real, and real channels can be discovered independently, though the maps of those channels that the different traditions produce will differ depending on what the tradition's founding teachers were told or shown. The Sumerian version of the map is the most detailed and the most explicitly technical of the surviving versions. This is probably because the Sumerian tradition was the one with the most direct and the most recently maintained contact with the entities who built the system. The shamanic traditions of other cultures preserved older, less complete, more symbolically mediated versions of the same map. The mystery school traditions of later civilizations preserved more complete but more esoteric encoded versions. The Sumerian temple tradition preserved the most operationally explicit version because it was operating at a time and in a cultural context where the Anunnaki's presence in human affairs was most direct and their communication with the temple institutions most specific. What's unusual about the current moment in this long conversation is the emergence of new evidence from an unexpected direction. The last decade has seen a significant shift in mainstream scientific discussions of consciousness, of what consciousness is, of where it resides, of what happens to it at death. The disciplines of neuroscience, quantum physics, and philosophy of mind have been converging on questions that they cannot answer with existing frameworks, and that look, when translated from scientific language into ordinary language, remarkably like the questions the Sumerian texts were addressing 4,000 years ago. What is consciousness? Is it reducible to brain activity? If the brain generates consciousness, where does consciousness go when the brain stops functioning? If consciousness is not generated by the brain but is instead something the brain accesses or interfaces with, then the brain's death doesn't imply the end of consciousness, only the end of the brain's access to or expression of consciousness. And if consciousness continues after the brain stops, where does it go? Under what conditions? For how long? What determines those conditions? These are the questions that parapsychology, near-death experience research, and the emerging field of consciousness studies have been accumulating evidence around. The evidence is controversial. The interpretations are contested. But the pattern that emerges from thousands of documented near-death experiences, from the laboratory research on consciousness at the edges of biological function, from the theoretical work in quantum approaches to consciousness, is a pattern that increasingly maps onto the structure described in the Sumerian afterlife texts. Consciousness continues beyond biological death. The continuation is structured. There appears to be a processing or transition period. There appears to be some mechanism by which the quality of the continuation relates to the quality and character of the consciousness that enters it. None of this proves the Sumerian accounts accurate. None of it validates the ancient astronaut interpretation of those accounts. What it does is establish that the questions the Sumerian texts were addressing are real questions. Questions that empirical investigation is beginning to approach from a completely different direction, and that the answers beginning to emerge from that investigation are not inconsistent with the structure described in the ancient tablets. The possibility that ancient Sumerian scribes and modern consciousness researchers are approaching the same phenomenon from opposite ends of a 4,000-year tunnel is exactly the kind of possibility that the ancient astronaut field was built to explore. It is not a probability that mainstream scholarship is comfortable assigning, but it is a possibility that the evidence, taken as a whole, does not rule out. What do we do with 5 descriptions of the afterlife from a civilization that has been right about enough things in enough domains to deserve a serious audience? We study them with the rigor they deserve. We resist the temptation to reduce them to allegory when they resist that reduction. We notice when the structure they describe appears independently in other traditions and ask what that independent appearance implies. We take seriously the possibility that the precision and specificity of the descriptions reflects information rather than imagination. And we hold the question open. The Sumerians held it open too. They encoded the 5th description rather than stating it plainly, precisely because they understood that a plain statement invites a simple response, acceptance or rejection, and that the 5th description deserves better than that. It deserves to be assembled piece by piece, from sources distributed across centuries and genres, by an audience that has done enough work to recognize what they're looking at when all the pieces come together. If you've come this far, you've done some of that work. The full assembly of the 5th description, the technical document hidden inside the mythology, is still incomplete. The fragments in the museums, the untranslated tablets still in storage, the texts damaged beyond recovery at the margins of every relevant excavation, represent a gap in the available evidence that may never be fully filled. But the structure is visible enough in what has survived to know that something is there, something that the civilization that built it thought was important enough to encode with extraordinary care across extraordinary time. 4,000 years ago, on clay tablets in the land between the rivers, a series of scribes wrote down what they had been told about what happens when you die, not as consolation, not as metaphor, as information, the most important information they could think of to preserve. They were right about the stars. They were right about the mathematics. They were right about the flood. The only question that remains, the one that the clay tablets themselves cannot answer, is whether they were right about this too. The answer is somewhere in the gap between what is written and what is known, between the dead language and the living question, between the managed facility of Ker and whatever lies beyond the gate that the 5th description points toward but cannot fully open. They left the map. The rest is up to us.